I'd like to thank the organisers for the opportunity to talk here today. It was suggested that I talk about the legacies and influences of Donald Horne and his work as a whole. Good topic. This paper will examine what might be learned from the legacy of Donald Horne. I've come up with some takeaways from his life and work. 1. It is good to be on the side of intelligence against stupidity. In the first volume of his autobiography, Horne, in the self-mocking tone he used, characterised his younger self as being on the side of intelligence against stupidity, capital I, capital S. Self-mocking aside, surely it's a good basic approach. What is intelligent and what is stupid is always up for debate, but it's better to use those words than other more ideologically laden words like left-wing or right-wing. Politics and ideas can sometimes be tribalism for people who don't like footy, and it can help to take the heat out of discussion by using words whose long history make them relatively immune to being characterised as ideological. More effective for the right to describe a particular policy as dumb rather than woke, and for the left to describe Aboriginal reconciliation as smart and based on fairness, rather than as part of an anti-colonialist agenda. Horne's intelligence against stupidity style was effective because of his natural curiosity, his wide reading, a propensity to argue a case strongly, and a willingness to change his mind. Some could reasonably argue that Horne wasn't a systematic thinker. For me, it depends on what you mean by system, but he did have a kind of systematic method of which he later called intelligent superficiality. If we accept that part of our genetic inheritance is an ability to philosophise, that, as Gramsci said, and which Horne often quoted, we are all intellectuals, then we shouldn't be afraid of a kind of rough and ready generalist approach. Horne's ideas on intelligent superficiality gave all human beings intellectual autonomy. You don't have to be a specialist to get something out of an intellectual exercise. Better to respect intellectual specialisations and expertise than to be intimidated by them. Take from them what you find useful. Always have an eye on the big picture. 2. Liberal humanism has something going for it. Horne was, generally speaking, always an advocate for basic freedoms and held a belief that we all share a common humanity. He grew up as a child of the Enlightenment, encouraged by his primary school teacher father to read and to ask questions, inspired by belief that education was growth. If you need a label, he argued, liberal humanist was a good, lowest common denominator one to go with. From his late high school days, he always had a suspicion of the supernatural and died without regrets on that front. Horne argued that Australia had a long tradition of a strain of liberal humanism with its 19th century enlightened improvers and its early voting and basic wage reforms. Liberal humanism, he argued, was Australia's best hope. As a side note, Horne could be seen as Australia's great enlightened improver in the field of ideas at a time when the country was ready for it. He was the OG public intellectual. 3. People can in good faith change their minds. As much as the use of left and right labels are inadequate and perhaps harmful, Horne could be said to have started on the left, moved right and returned left. He was a student radical who became a UK Tory when he returned to Australia, a right-wing Andersonian anti-communist, and then became a strong defender of the Whitlam government and advocate for sensible change. If you believe that the Donald Horne who came into public view in the last 4 decades of his life genuinely believed in what he was saying, as I do, then what to make of his earlier right-leaning interregnum? Was he an ideological weather vane? Was he a loudmouth without a legitimate cause? One could argue that he was a loudmouth, but I don't believe that he was ever without a legitimate cause. Ryan Kropp's Donald Horne, A Life in the Lucky Country, argues that Horne was an obnoxious rebel without a cause at university. I don't want to contest the obnoxiousness. It's all there in The Education of Young Donald. And Kropp's claim that The Education of Young Donald is not a record of documentary facts and is best seen as some kind of autofiction is a bit silly and belied by the fact that Kropp relies on it and all of Horne's autobiographical writing so heavily for his book. But I will contest the idea that Horne was causeless at university. Kropp's book, even at university, Kropp's book oddly questions Horne's honnêteté campaign against the censorship of Joyce's Ulysses, lampoons Horne's enlightened call for greater levels of sex education, and sees his filling out of bogus National Register cards during the Second World War as some kind of prank, as opposed to an act of minor, inconsequential political anarchism. But more importantly, what about Horne's period on the right? Kropp's book makes the point that Horne had a consistent kind of liberalism, that his apparent changing worldview had much to do with the changing of the world that he lived in. I agree. Although I think the book could have made that argument better, I'd like to turn to Horne's anti-communism to make that point. One of the most infamous anti-communist pieces Horne wrote was his review of Manning Clark's Meeting Soviet Man, displaying, some thought, an apocalyptic, over-the-top approach. Horne himself described his anti-communism as overzealous, but he never renounced the basic premise, and I think it's wrong to be distracted by the mocking style in his review and not examine his substantial arguments. Horne had learned the lessons from appeasement of the Nazis, and he was, it seemed logically, therefore anti-neutralist. True, Clark's little book wasn't communist propaganda, but nor in the middle of a Cold War that could potentially become a hot one was it unsupportive of the Soviet Union. You can, especially now, read Meeting Soviet Man as an intelligent piece of agnosticism, trying to see both sides, trying to explain how people of good faith were attracted to communism. But Horne makes some substantial valid criticisms. He criticises Clark's journalistic rigour, which, if you were to extrapolate to a tendency to have an eye on the big picture at the expense of specific accuracies, was something that, if Clark had acted on, might have helped him avoid later unnecessary petty controversies. He criticises Clark for not trying to contact Boris Pasternak, which, given Pasternak's treatment by the Soviets, might have been reason enough to cancel the trip in the first place. And he makes the point that as much as the death of Stalin had been significant, the invasion of Hungary as it would later turn out, the Cuban Missile Crisis would show, the Soviet Union was still a threat to world peace. If Horne's domestic anti-communism was overzealous, making much over what were little more than internecine union battles, his highlighting of an international communist threat was on firmer ground. He wasn't being merely mean and hawkish, he was defending liberal values. 4, the world is complex. I'm talking about pluralism here, but not pluralism with a capital P, so complex it is. Horne was ambivalent about the intellectual inheritance he got from John Anderson, but one thing he was thankful for was the idea that the world is complex, that there are many different, often competing forces that make up a society. When the song "We Are One, but We Are Many" came out, Horne remarked that obviously we were many, but what one were we? He was against the idea that he wasn't against the idea that there was a one, but he was very much against the idea that that oneness should be a manufactured idea of national self-consciousness that didn't reflect the reality of our diversity. Horne's idea of national self-consciousness led him naturally to republicanism. His republicanism wasn't based just on democratic ideals and against hereditary rule, but also on a raising of national self-awareness. One of the big changes between now and 60 years ago is that we no longer see ourselves as British. In that sense, at one level, it is less important for us to have the conversation about becoming a republic than it was in the 60s. That argument might have morphed a bit, but it has by and large been won. At another level, the idea that we should have a hereditary ruler from another country, England, that doesn't even reflect the entirety of the UK itself is even more stupid. As part of his belief that the world is complex, Horne was a strong advocate for tolerance. He wrote a book about it. An unavoidably complex, pluralistic world needs beliefs in tolerance to function to its best potential. But if tolerance is to be effective, it has to go both ways. It's not just about a call for, say, tolerance and understanding when it comes to the plight of refugees. It also has to be, on the other side of the coin, a tolerance and understanding that there might be a fear and distrust of refugees that has to be dealt with. There needs to be a stronger awareness that we are not just the sum of our political beliefs and that we will always share a common humanity. 5, we have cultural rights. It's good to see Max Burke here. Horne argued that just as governments needed to sometimes intervene to maintain an economic market, it also needed to ensure that there was a healthy market for ideas and culture. For a representative democracy to function well, it needs an informed citizenry, and a liberal society needs a marketplace of values, knowledge and ideas, providing diverse opportunities for opening out human potential. His term as chair of the Australia Council and the Ideas for Australia program were marked by a strong advocacy of the importance of arts and ideas, of the arts and ideas. 6, things will go wrong. One of the perennials of Horne's work is irony, that and a kind of hard-boiled humour. I think this developed as an organic response to the reality that in life things don't always go your way. But rather than slitting your wrists, it's better to take a step back, put things into perspective and move on. I won't go into details here, but an analysis of the relationship Horne had with his father is crucial to understanding him. Dave had encouraged his son to think for himself and speak his mind, and that's pretty much what he did for the rest of his life. Dave had a mental breakdown when Horne was 15, and the lifelong effect that his father's collapse had on him was evidenced in an interview he had with Philip Adams just before he died. As the topic of his father came up, he burst into tears, as I almost did. It was a surprise to those of us who knew him well, and is something of a rosebud moment. I wouldn't argue that Horne's experience with his father was the one factor that forced him to take a step back and put things into perspective. But I would argue that his ability to deal with a setback and live a productive life showed an inspiring case that you have to play the cards you're dealt, personally and political. So, 6 takeaways from his life and work. I'd now like to make a comment about the lucky country. I won't talk about its themes, but I'd like to argue that it isn't populist. A few critics have argued that it is. If populism can mean having a belief in the inherent wisdom of the people, Horne's position was more that the people aren't inherently unwise. No doubt the people of Australia aren't perfect, but nor are they beyond redemption. His view of the good qualities of the Australian people, beautifully articulated in the last paragraph of the book, seemed to me realistic and unromanticised. Intellectuals need to have faith in the potential of the Australian people. If populism can mean having cheap shots at elites, Horne's argument, which he held throughout his life and elaborated in looking for leadership a few years before he died, was that leaders need to be held to a higher standard than ordinary people. One could argue that he was at times hyperbolic in his criticism of Australian leadership, but there's nothing wrong with holding leaders to account. One way that Australia has changed in the last 60 years is the level of education, both at secondary and tertiary level. In 1964, many people didn't complete high school and fewer went to university. Horne's book came out when we were still a nation without a mind, and was part of a series of books that established a beachhead for ideas in the Australian public culture. These days, there is what might be called an educated class, in a way that there wasn't 60 years ago. By and large, that's a good thing, but there is a divide between that educated class and other citizens of the country. When you throw in the rise of social media and increased sources of information and disinformation, this divide is of concern. If the task for intellectuals in the 60s was to get their heads above water, one task for today's intellectuals is to attempt to bridge the divide between the educated and the less educated. Our health as a democracy depends on it.
So I'm reduced to oxymoron because I think that intelligent superficiality doesn't really cover it. I think profound superficiality is what we've seen exposed by Nick. You've done your father justice, and I hope you feel that very strongly. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions, but I know that you'll surround Nick at morning tea. I hope you'll be staying for morning tea.
Yep.
And invite him to say more about his ideas. I'm very touched to have had you here today, and not least because you look like your dad. Yeah. I don't know whether that's been a good thing or a bad thing from your own personal point of view. It is, but it is. It's very moving.
Fat-faced and bald.
Could we take 5? Okay, let's take 5. Questions or comments for Nick? What was the best place you ever went on one of these trips, on one of these road trips? What was your favorite place?
We did so many.
Very good. We have a question. Where are we? Here we go.
Hi, I'm Stephen Pascoe, UNSW. Thank you so much for that very touching tribute to your dad. I was really struck by your categorisation of him as a liberal humanist and his defence of liberal humanism. I wonder if you might have anything to say about what you see of that tradition today, if it still exists, and if so, who you think might embody it.
Yeah. Well, I think as Australians, we at least have the idea that we believe in a fair go. So I think that's something that we can, if not, perhaps resuscitate. I think liberal humanism is something that comes naturally to Australians, a sense of belief in freedoms, a shared sort of common humanity. Where is it going? I would say this: that it's a good doctrine to articulate and to sort of advocate for. You know.
Thanks, Nick. It was wonderful. I wanted to ask you the writings of your, or perhaps the book your father wrote that spoke the most to you. I mean, you must know, given that you edited his work, I mean, you must know it absolutely inside out. And I just wondered what has spoken to you most.
Yeah, there's an easy answer to that: The Education of Young Donald. I would have read it a dozen times, looked into it many, sort of poked into little bits and pieces. Doing the editing, the selected writings, I typed out all the selections which was a great exercise. I recommend it if you want to get under the skin of a writer. I'm a big fan of all his work. I think every piece is worth. Even the works that don't succeed are worth reading. But certainly with the education of young Donald, I mean, it gave an insight into my family life, into him, and it's such a good read. Thank you.
I told Nick that The Education of Young Donald was the first book that I read when I came to Australia in 1978. It's so elegiac and lyrical, and I thought, I'm pretty lucky to be living here. I didn't know yet about the lucky country. So will you join me, please, in thanking Nick? And we're very